Our first panel is going to discuss setting the stage, the need to integrate space operations. This will be led by ALPA's Aviation Safety Chair, Captain Steve Jangelis. He also flies Airbus 320 for the Delta Airlines currently. He's been serving as the ALPA Aviation Safety Chair since 2017, and in that role he leads the air safety organization, of which I am a part, and many of the other volunteers who are at ALPA here today, they serve in that role, which he oversees. Prior to that, Steve was also airport and ground environment chairman in the air safety organizations. Esteban, you have the controls.
Thank you, Don. I appreciate the kind introduction. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this very important commercial spaceflight and aviation symposium discussion on the need to integrate space operations. It's my pleasure to have a panel of experts up here to join me, but to open up and for the folks that are just tuning in, we had some very inspiring words from the presidents of both the Commercial Spaceflight Federation and also the Airline Pilots Association, talking about the need for all of us to get together and sit down and talk and discuss these issues that we may have. We have a group of organizations and corporations that are working in an airspace that's been around since the beginning of time, but we've gradually started to see new entrants approach. Of course, first the birds had it, and then manned flight came in. And then after that, we started to see some unmanned vehicles, as well as space vehicles, starting to enter into the airspace. And now all of these entities are trying to mix together. We always say the big sky theory is going to take place, and don't worry, it'll all separate itself out. But what we all want to do is, and for the folks that are joining us here today, is to sit down and talk about where do we need to be, where do we need to go, and what do we need to do to make sure that all of these operations stay safe. So joining me on the panel today, my team of great panelists and well-renowned industry experts, I'd like to introduce them all to you. First, I'd like to start off with Ms. Audrey Powers, Deputy General Counsel of Blue Origin. Mr. Wayne Monteith, the FAA's Associate Administrator for Commercial Space Transportation. Mr. Mark Hopkins, Director of the Air Traffic Management for Delta Airlines. Ms. Heidi Williams, Director of Air Traffic Services and Infrastructure for the National Business Aviation Association, and Captain Brian Teske, a Boeing 737 captain for Delta Airlines and our space subject matter expert. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. To start it off, we all have wants and needs. Each one of our organizations want to do something, they want to get somewhere, they have an agenda. The idea is obviously to be for profit. Well, how do we all do this? How do we mix together? Again, wants and needs. So going down the line, I'd like to just go to each individual person on the panel and ask, what is your organization looking to do in today's present day operations? Audrey, if I could start with you.
Sure. So for those who might not be familiar, Blue Origin has a current suborbital vehicle program that we're operating out of our private launch site in West Texas. So it's a launch site that we developed and designed and built, and it's on our property. And that's where we operate our New Shepard vehicle from. We're also developing an orbital vehicle program that's going to launch from Cape Canaveral in Florida. So our goals when we look at this this topic is how do we arrive, how do we go from where we are today to an integrated future state where this national resource that is our national airspace system maintains the high level of safety that we have today, but really really improves on some of the inefficiencies that we've all identified that exist in current day operations. And how do we make that that safe environment available to all of the users who might need to use this national resource? And I think that the way we look at it at Blue Origin is everybody who's involved in this has some responsibility to help progress this system into the future. So from an operator perspective, not only are we looking at our future operations at Cape Canaveral, where the Eastern Range and Miami Center's engagement with the operators from Cape Canaveral, that is a rather structured system that has existed for a long time. The players know each other rather well. When you show up on the range as a new operator, there's a system that you're moving into that's fairly well established. When you look at what we're doing as a private site operator in West Texas, we're rather new to this. And not only are we new to this, but the air traffic system that we're entering into there, at the time we started this 6 years ago, they were rather new to it too. We were certainly not as well informed as the Eastern Range was, who'd been dealing with things like this for decades. So we all had to get together and figure out, educate ourselves on the system. So Blue Origin had to say, how does this air traffic system work? What are the constraints on Albuquerque from publishing NOTAMs and their timelines and getting information to their controllers and then out to the pilots who are operating in the airspace? So we really had to look to first hire people who maybe had this knowledge to help Blue Origin get up to speed, but then what kind of systems do we need to put in place to tie our operations really well into what was going on at Albuquerque Center? So really a very different model as you see some of these private launch sites and spaceports, licensed spaceports coming online that just don't fit that traditional model of a federal range where things are a little bit more routinized. So we really think that everybody involved has to get to know each other and understand each other's operations and constraints, and we really saw that happen with Albuquerque Center. The other piece of this is the other operators in the airspace. We really need to work together to understand each other's operations. So how does a commercial space launch impact general aviators or the airline industry? And that's something, as Eric mentioned earlier, we've been really making an effort over the past 2 years to understand. A lot of meetings are taking place and a lot of just educational discussions about, why do orbital mechanics drive specific launch windows, and what does it mean when an aircraft has to reroute around a space operation? So there's really been a lot of effort, in my opinion, over the past couple of years for all the different users of the airspace to get educated about each other's stuff so that we can be a little bit more empathetic when one of us comes to the other and says, hey, this is my issue, help me deal with it. And you actually want to, because you have issues too that you want them to help you deal with. So those are some of the things that we're most interested in engaging with the centers and the other operators, and I think we've seen with the FAA's efforts in setting up this ARC and really looking at what tool development should we have in the future to kind of make all of the processes and users operate in the most efficient manner and flow information most efficiently. So that tool development that the ARC really focused on, we think is a big piece of getting to that future integrated state that is safe and most efficient for everyone.
That's great, and the outreach that you're doing, just to the centers that you're operating with is definitely valuable, and that's the key. I think getting out there and meeting with the stakeholders, and that's exactly what we're all doing here with this conference here. So I applaud Blue Origin for working on that outreach as well. If I look towards Mark, how many flights a day does Delta Airlines operate?
So mainline Delta, which is non-regional, we're running about 3,000 flights a day. So
that's a lot of flights, and that's just one airline in our airspace system right now. So Mark, like I say, wants and needs. What's Delta Airlines looking to do as we maneuver through the airspace here, and we've got different launch sites that are now starting to increase as spaceports are starting to creep up into not just coastal areas, but now we're starting to see them in the mainland, in the middle of the heartland of the country. How does Delta Airlines plan to maneuver and work through that?
Right. So, Steve, our foundational goal is to operate the schedule every day and operate it as reliably and efficiently as possible. And when we talk about reliability and efficiency, we're not so much talking about fuel, we're talking about time. We know from our customers that they value that reliability that's out there. So as far as the system builds out and we integrate operators, commercial space operators into the system, we need to look at being preemptive and not reactive to what's happening. We can move quickly if we're given the correct information to do what we need to do with our flights and accommodate everybody in an integrated system. There's a lot of work that we'd like to engage in to reconcile the needs of everybody to run the system as efficiently as we possibly can. It's not a prioritized system. It's a system that's open to all, and there's enough, certainly enough data out there to be able to plan and be preemptive around what the operation looks like for that day, especially for known quantities such as space launches, as opposed to the example that Eric gave of a thunderstorm over Kentucky. We kind of know the thunderstorm is going to be somewhere in Kentucky, but it's still a constraint in the system that's not known until it occurs. So we want to work with folks to figure out what that looks like going forward. I appreciate what Audrey said about people working together to understand each other's operation and each other's issues and goals. I would say we'd be more than welcome to inviting people to come into the ops center, as we did with the ARC, to understand the whole process of flight planning and flight following and ops management to manage the whole system that we run every day.
That's great. And speaking those are some great words, being proactive rather than reactive. I think that's the key for all of us, is to know that these operations are going to occur, and how do we maneuver around them and work our way around that. And I think that's great, as being in front of it rather than reactionary to it. So that's a big key. Heidi, could you tell us about some of your constituents and who you work with and where they fly to and how this could affect them?
Absolutely. So I'm representing the National Business Aviation Association. And in a nutshell, we're representing companies that utilize aircraft in furtherance of their business. So they aren't necessarily an aviation business, but they are using aviation to pursue business interest and to enhance their business opportunities. I'd say in a word, the goal was integration, right? I don't think that's a surprise to anybody. But the devil's always in the details, right? It sounds simple. I think we spent the last 2 years, with a lot of different users coming to the table, kind of ingrained in our way of thinking, our way of doing business, especially from the manned part of this business. Thinking that we had a system that works and we just need folks to integrate with how we do things. Quite frankly, that's not how we're gonna move forward. Captain DePete, I really appreciated the words he said today. We built a system around one type of user, a manned user. And we're finding out with the onset of urban air mobility and UAS and commercial space, which has been around a lot longer than some of those other new entrants, that our existing system may not meet the needs of all users. And we all share this resource. So I absolutely appreciate Mark and Audrey's words about, appreciate ALPA and CSF bringing us together to have conversation. But we really had a great opportunity the past 2 years through this several ARC processes to learn more. I think that's, I came out of the last 2 years. It was a lot of work, it was a lot of fun, new friendships were made, but honestly, it was a learning process for me. And I think I found it was a much steeper learning curve than maybe I envisioned originally, but a newfound appreciation for all of the things that go into another type of user of the airspace. And so there are things like optimization of our airspace that Mark mentioned. Yeah, absolutely, we need to optimize and to get more efficient, not just for manned, but for unmanned, for commercial space. That might mean a complete redesign of our airspace structure. In fact, I'd venture to say that's probably what's going to be needed. But we can't do that in a vacuum. It's going to take a lot of the discussions like we had the past 2 years with users from all across the industry, not just commercial space, not just airlines. It's going to take general aviation. It's going to take unmanned and urban air mobility operators, folks that are creating new eVTOL systems that want to operate in a metroplex. All of those folks have to be sitting at the table in order to create a system that ultimately, moving forward, works for everyone. And it's the only way we're going to get to optimization. It's one of the things. There's a lot of tools and capabilities that we talk through as part of that ARC process. We also talked about collaborative decision making. And as a manned community, we have a pretty good system through CDM, collaborative decision making, that Mark and several of us operate and participate in. And I think we need something like that. Maybe it's not the existing CDM, but it's something very similar. And I think that was a big part of our recommendations from that airspace access ARC, that we said, what, a system operates by data sharing, information sharing, things that we can utilize in the pre-flight arena, in the dynamic operational arena, and also from a post-analysis arena. We talked about ASIAS and CAST already this morning. Those are all systems and analysis that are done from data that's shared. And I think Mark's right. We have a lot of good data out there. We're not necessarily sharing that across the industry right now. So we're looking for a process by which everybody comes to the table, we share that data, and it's used to do pre-flight planning and post-op analysis so that we do get more efficient.
Absolutely well said, Heidi, and you are spot on when you say that we do there will be issues where we could look back and all of our operations do have a post-flight or a post-mission debrief, and I think that as we sit down and we start to operate with more frequency, eventually we as a whole industry are going to have to sit down and talk about, well, what are we doing right? What needs improvement? And we have to continue this. Just because we did a couple ARCs for the last couple of years doesn't mean the work is done. We have to continue the dialogue and keep talking. So well said, Heidi. Thank you very much. Look at the end, Brian. Captain Brian, you are flying your 737 across the terra firma, and you have what on your mind regarding spaceflight? You're operating your flight from point A to point B.
Well, besides the excitement of the technology and the advances, for me, there's a micro and a macro portion of this. As an airline pilot, I need to have accurate information, real-time information via NOTAMs or other communication venues. From a macro standpoint, from the Airline Pilot Association, we need to be a stakeholder in how we build the foundation of how the airspace will operate. A good example of the effect, I think, that both commercial space and the airlines were able to glean was the launch in 2018 of the Falcon Heavy. So that we as the Airline Pilot Association realized, well, the launch window has to be a certain length of time, at that time anyway, to encompass fueling and to encompass orbital dynamics and whatnot. And from the airline standpoint, then we were able to measure how many flights were affected by that, how many miles. I think as we move forward from the macro standpoint, understanding each other's needs and wants of all the stakeholders that are going to be in the NAS will help us, as Heidi said, to possibly redesign the NAS itself, how it works or how we utilize it.
And I try to surround myself with very smart people like the folks up here on the panel because I'm Steve and I fly the plane very high. But I try to work with folks and learn from them. And Brian is very close to his PhD in orbital science?
It's aerospace sciences, safety management system and commercial space operations.
So I rely on my subject matter experts that are on my team to give us the information and help us work with you folks in the spaceflight industry, to work together and talk in the common language and to try to come up with common ground and common goal for all of us to work this out. So Brian, thanks for your input on that. So moving ahead, we have Wayne not strategically placed in the middle of the panel, but I work my way towards the regulator now. And Wayne, you've heard us all talk, and you've been a part of these discussions along the way. You've heard all of our wants and needs and where we want to go. How do we do it? How does the FAA regulate? How does it implement? How does it work towards safe operations and continuing increased operations?
Well, first off, thanks for inviting me here, because I think venues like this or forums like this are absolutely critical for us to have the ability to move forward. We talk different languages. We look at the problem differently. We look at risk differently. If we can't talk to each other, no amount of technology will fix where we are right now. So with that as a baseline, I would add to that both of these industries must be successful, not just from a national economic standpoint, but a national security standpoint. So we have to figure out how to do this. We have to figure our way through this dilemma of shared airspace, a finite NAS, and today we primarily segregate. We need to move to the point where we can integrate. But a couple of things. So Heidi said something that struck me, and I heard this when I first got to the FAA. And I've been in this business for 30 years now. And I went to a meeting, and it was a new entrant meeting. And the meeting was for me. And I'm like, okay, what are we going to talk about? Well, you guys being the new entrant. And I was like, the first commercial launch was 35 years ago. At what point, do we get a driver's license, or we can vote, or we're able to drink? 35 years. Our major companies have been flying for a decade to 2 decades, but we're still considered a new entrant. And I think that's part of the problem, how we perceive what's going on. Now, this industry is different, but we regulate this industry based on public safety. But we also, as Heidi, I believe, also mentioned, we do talk different language. We look at risk differently. We look at how we protect the public differently. Aviation is established enough that we can do things like 10 to the minus 9, and we can accomplish that. Every single space launch, quite frankly, is a controlled explosion. That's what it is. And so we have to look at risk differently. We have to understand that this industry can't operate, say, at 10 to the minus 9. We have to be able to articulate that to each other, and we have to be able to talk to the American people about that too. And the American people don't understand risk per se either. We have one autonomous vehicle, car, crash into an embankment, and it's all over the news. Yet we don't talk about the 100 Americans who die every day on average in vehicles. But that one autonomous car that crashes, oh my gosh, we need to, we need to figure out how to make that go away. The reason I bring that up is because the way for us to get through this is technology. That's the only way we're going to solve this. Brian mentioned the Falcon Heavy. Well, I was running the Eastern Range when we flew that Falcon Heavy mission. The risk, the danger from that mission was over in about 8.5 minutes. Yet it was at least 3 times that long before the airspace was reopened, at least 3 times that long. And so, and that's because we use SneakerNet, we use voice links, handshakes. We're not doing machine-to-machine interfaces to be able to get this data and move this data quickly. That's the only way we're going to be able to integrate through this. Now, the FAA has talked about this issue for more than 2 decades. I've got letters from previous administrators that say this is a priority and we're going to fix this. Office of Commercial Space Transportation, you guys go fix this. The other thing I realized when I got to the FAA in January was that to fix this, I needed 4 things that I didn't have. I needed the requirements, I needed the schedule, I needed the money, and I needed the priority. And I had none of those, but I was responsible for integrating space into the NAS. So one of the things that we did about 2 months ago is we transferred primary responsibility to solve this problem to Terry Bristol and the ATO team, with us still fully engaged, but she's responsible for managing the NAS. And so without their support, this is never going to happen. and we are working very well together. But as you heard from each panelist, this is not easy, and each approaches it from a different perspective. But we have to solve this. You know, this fiscal year, this past fiscal year, we had 32 flight operations, commercial space flight operations. Looking just 2 years down the road, we could go up another 50 to 100%, and that's conservative. By 2023, it could be an order of magnitude higher than what we do today. We could get into the hundreds. So we've got to work through this. And then the final thing I'll close on is the discussion about spaceports. Again, that's a communications issue. You know, one of the first trips I took was out to Colorado because I had heard so much about the angst between Front Range and Denver International, and even counties not seeing eye to eye on this problem. And it didn't take long to figure out that many in the community thought we were going to launch Saturn V from just outside Denver. And that's not what's going to happen. They were licensed for a horizontal takeoff capability. And so we talked through it, and I talked through with the Denver Airport leadership team and understood all of the concerns. Well, then I turned to a controller in the tower, and I said, "You worried about this?" He said, "No, we'll sequence them." You know, they looked at it just as another aircraft. Now it's carrying a hazardous cargo, but it's another aircraft that's going to fly somewhere else and drop. So again, it's important that we communicate with each other and we keep these dialogues going. Otherwise, the technology solution will just never appear. That's
great insight on that, and you know, the idea of the technology. I appreciate those words, Wayne. I mean, that's where we have to go. So as organizations on the panel, you know, how do we implement or work with that equipment or technology to try to get enhanced surveillance, more tools for the air traffic controllers to track, better advisories of, like you said, Wayne, you said the Eastern Range, we 8 minutes and closed off for much longer than that. You know, obviously for safety purposes, to keep everyone, you know, safe until we can refine this. How do we get down to refining it into a tighter window or closer arrangements? Audrey, any thoughts on that?
Well, I think I echo Wayne's point about tools. So there are a lot of tools that FAA has looked at in the past. There's the Space Data Integrator, there's ATRAN, there's a number of different approaches that have been considered. And I think that we're probably all aligned. The ARC was very helpful in this, but I think a lot of our industry conversations have really helped us all get aligned to what we need in the information that we need getting to the pilots are what is the hazard area, real time as the launch vehicles and reentry vehicles are moving through the NAS, what is the real hazard area that I have to avoid? And there are tools out there that are capable of doing their prototype form. One's been developed by the FAA. There are also some other university researchers that have developed tools. So there are tools being developed out there and that are already in existence that calculate in real time the aircraft hazard areas. So that's one piece, is how do we get those tools to be fully operational, available not only to the controllers, but the data flowing to the pilots that are traversing the airspace that's being affected. But then it's also, how do you get those tools to the operators so that, for example, when Blue Origin is planning its operations, we can proactively look, if we launch at 3 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon, what is the disruption likely to be? If we launch at 10 o'clock on a Saturday morning, what is the disruption likely to be? So we can use it in our analysis, pre and post flight analysis, to look at how can we best approach this, and then on the back end, could we have done this better? So I think there are a lot of nuances to this tool discussion, and a lot of us say tools, which is absolutely right. But to Heidi's point, the details of what we're doing with those tools really matter. And Blue Origin has engaged with the FAA to flow vehicle state of health, state vector type telemetry from our New Shepard launches to the data center. to the FAA's data center, and that's great. It was great to set up the telemetry links from a flying vehicle all the way out to the FAA's data center. But at the end of the day, I don't think state vector information, to Wayne's point, how quickly these things are traversing the NAS. You know, is it helpful to know that's the state vector of the vehicle? Okay, for situational awareness, certainly. But what's important is if something goes wrong, what is the hazard area that I have to avoid, right? The box around that operation. So we've taken steps to help pieces of this, but I think some of those details are the ones that, to Wayne's point, we need to prioritize, and everybody needs to get aligned with these are the priorities that we're trying to address.
Are there avenues for that discussion to take place? Wayne, I mean, are we having those discussions with the industry in an ARC setup or a discussion forum on what are we going to prioritize? Where are we going to go with this technology?
We are having some of those discussions. I don't think we're having enough of those discussions, to be honest with you. As Audrey mentioned, Space Data Integrator is just one potential solution. And that was the other reason, you know, in my mind, to move responsibility for integrating into the NAS to ATO, because we already, for the last 10 years, we knew what the solution was in my office. And so if you want to look at other solutions, you've got to make a hard rudder input. But even looking at if SDI, Space Data Integrator, was the solution, today, as Audrey mentioned, you know, as we try to determine what the hazard area is on an anomalous flight, a catastrophic anomaly, by the time you realize that you've had a telemetry problem and you've got a breakup of a vehicle in flight at an altitude that it could become a hazard, till you get information into the cockpit that you can actually do a control input, best case is about 14 minutes. But in reality, it's about 16, 17 minutes. That's why the TFRs are as big as they are. That's why the windows are as big as they are. That's why you're 24 minutes before you're crossing through the previous restricted area after a successful flight. With something like Space Data Integrator, you take that whole chain and you get that data to the pilots in less than 60 seconds. That's where we need to go. And it's, Audrey's exactly right. You've got to be able to, in real time, develop the hazard area. You've got to be able to get that information out there, and the information's got to be secure enough that it doesn't corrupt anything else in the cockpit or corrupt anything with the air traffic management system. That's the hard part. The gonculating the data is not nearly as hard as it is interfacing with a system that cannot be corrupted.
That's, you know, that's you know, like you say, the 16 minutes, that's a very, very, you know, long time downrange to get to a crew, you know, via the telephone game, to get to someone that could take a difference of an aircraft, you know, either passing through the hazard area or going around it. So definitely something to look at. Mark, I ask you a question from a dispatch point, from an operations control center point. When we deal with hazard areas and that, and we get the NOTAMs that a launch is supposed to occur, do you have a team available that starts looking at this and working with that data, and how do they put that into the flight planning symbol?
Right, yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Steve, because pilots and controllers work in real time. While it's important to get it up to the flight deck and to get it on the scope for the controller, it's just as important to get it proactively to the ops center, to the dispatchers and the ops managers, and to figure out what the plan is for that individual flight and feed that up to the flight deck, probably through the tablet that everybody has nowadays, to understand what's going to happen. So to answer your question, yes, the dispatchers are responsible for evaluating the NOTAMs that have that information, and we also receive the information on the TFRs and the timing through the command center, through several different interfaces that we have with the command center. And that's all vetted through our strategic planning team on the floor of the ops center, who coordinate with the individual dispatchers on timing and what needs to happen with the flight and what needs to happen with the flight crew. In today's world, unfortunately, it may involve a delay on the ground. It may involve a deviation from what the optimal route is. So we need to be more connected and better at understanding what that looks like proactively. So again, I'll say that. This sounds to us a lot like a lot of little eyes, a lot of little improvements that are out there using the data. And we're hearing a lot about different pieces of technology that are out there. So how do we, from an overarching perspective, pull that together collectively and collaboratively to understand what the next steps need to be? I don't know if that's a federal advisory committee or a CD. It certainly sounds like a collaborative or CDM type environment, right? All those little eyes then will lead to what the big eye is what does the airspace need to look like integrated with all this technology and all this data to be optimized and not prioritized, right? There's so much out there now, and there's more that's coming into the system every day. Somebody before mentioned space-based ADS-B and surveillance. The amount of data that Aerion collects from every single flight is incredible, and it's growing every day. It's things that we've never seen before and certainly have never understood before that we can use to look at that trends and look at what's going to happen, look out into the airspace to see what's going to happen down the road. So those are the kind of things that coming out of today we need to think about what that looks like from a collective perspective and what the next steps are to get there, and not just talk about all the things that are out there, but how do we actually tie that all together and start that work? It's going to take a while, but the pieces are there.
And it starts with the discussions.
Yep.
So Brian, I ask you, have you seen, and with the up-tempo of operations in space, and mostly at the coastal areas, but we're going to start to see them more towards the White Sands area in that direction, in the center of the country. Are you starting to see anything noticeable on the flight deck regarding space launches or NOTAMs related to that, maybe carrying an extra amount of fuel on a certain flight? Has that been sort of the mode training-wise? Has there been any input to us yet?
I haven't really heard of anything or seen anything specific. I think if you are on a flight that goes, let's say, Puerto Rico to JFK, which is the one that ALPA used in both of our white papers as an example, you would have information from the dispatcher because there would be some information that came from ATC as far as delays. But if I'm in the cockpit and I'm discussing the California space or Colorado spaceport and its location, how close it is to the Denver International Airport, and the effect it might have if you put a debris field over that. And I don't know that a lot of pilots currently are aware of the operations and the increase in operations that we have. And I wanted to circle back to a comment Wayne made. Pardon me. I think a lot of us, I'll speak for myself, I look at Falcon Heavy with awe and inspiration, and I'm a little boy watching an Apollo launch. And I think we need to move past that where it's an awe, everything's out of the way, let's make this happen, as the tempo begins to increase of commercial. And really, we're talking about private companies that are doing commercial space. That's really started, I think the increase is, you could say, 2004, when Spaceship One went into space and won the Ansari Prize. That's been a dramatic escalation in commercial space operations since that point. But once we move past the Apollo moment is a term that I use, but look at this as an everyday, every person operation into low Earth orbit or into space tourism or whatever the future will hold, high Mach, whatever the future may hold, then we'll be able to understand the wants and needs of all the stakeholders that are in the NAS and move forward from that point on.
That's a great point too, because you brought up the different types of vehicles that we're dealing with here. For the folks that are with us on the web today, or folks that are new to the discussion, we're not just dealing with vertical launch vehicles anymore. We're dealing with capture carry. We're dealing with horizontal launch vehicles, which, you're dealing with if you will, a mothership that has to depart like an airplane, return like an airplane. So, there's different windows of where a hazard area could exist, and there could be a difference in timing. So we, as the legacy air operators, the airlines, we have to sort of look away from that idea that we're just going to be thinking about a vertical launch in 8 minutes, it's out of the way and gone. That we have to consider that there might be a loiter operation involved with, getting a vehicle into orbit. So, good point to bring up, and I think that it's definitely a good discussion. Heidi, a question for you, for your organization, for your constituents. If there's a lot of information that's out there that's being pushed out by the FAA, NOTAM service. A lot of your constituents are a one airplane operation, two jet operation. How do they get the information that this is going on and happening? And are you getting any feedback from your constituents on the increased tempo of operations in the past year or so?
So a good question, because I think the business aviation, general aviation community certainly operate under a different set of rules than the airline community, which typically has a dispatch center, an ops center, and all of that information is collected and kind of provided to the pilot. A lot of our operators can be single operators that don't have a dispatcher, aren't dispatching the flight, to the larger fleets that may have a scheduler and dispatcher, but don't operate in the same manner that a scheduler and dispatcher for the airline does. So you find that a lot of our community is getting that information on an EFB or some type of mobile device to the cockpit. So they are getting information real time. The reality, though, is we have an education and a training piece of this that we haven't really talked about yet, that we say real time, but a lot of what we're doing today isn't real time. It's kind of like TFRs. We segregate operation, and then the TFR comes down half hour, 2 hours, 3 hours after whatever hazard it is. And that can be a VIP movement, that could be a commercial space launch. So the operator only has the information that TFR, that segregated airspace, is active or it's not. We don't really have additional layers of information that says, okay, there's no longer a hazard here, that TFR could probably come down. So we're in need of some tools that get us to what is more real-time information. And information flow is great. You mentioned our NOTAM system. I know there's a number of us in the audience that participate in an Aeronautical Information Reform Coalition, talking about some of our challenges that we need to get beyond in our aeronautical data and information flow. We have some challenges. I mean, we went in and talked to Terry, and Wayne, I'm thrilled to actually hear that you and Terry and your organizations are working much more closely aligned, because you're right, there's so much about even the recommendations that we put forward in that ARC process, talking about tools and capabilities, that if we don't have the PMO and Terry's organization and their kind of their automation cycle, NAS automation tools was a great example of where we need tools and capabilities on controller scopes. That doesn't happen overnight with a system like ERAM. We have to be part of acquisition cycles and cycles where we get that into the process. It just doesn't happen overnight. So we might have the technology, it's here, but we can't integrate it into our existing platforms. We have to be able to make that happen more agilely. How do we do that? Well, it's through processes like CDM. We do this in the MAN community. We come together, we talk about tools and capabilities, what is needed, what's gonna work. We do the post-op analysis on it. But we also talk about, okay, how do we prioritize that? There's 20 different tools we talked about as part of our ARC process. We can't deliver all of those capabilities overnight, right? We can't integrate all of those tools that are needed overnight. So what's the priority to make that happen? Do we have the finances to make that happen? Where are we in the acquisition process to get it into the pipeline? So there's a whole lot that has to take place. And I honestly think industry and the business aviation community, the airlines, the commercial space and aerospace industries have to sit at the same table and do that. You know, we made some pretty aggressive timeline recommendations on bringing some of those groups together. We hope to hear soon from the FAA that that's what's happening, that we're bringing those groups to the table, whether it be an ARC or a working group or CDM-like group. I don't think it necessarily matters what the title is, as long as you bring the right folks together and that information is shared.
Great stuff, and it's definitely important for us to think about that. Well, you know, we know that Wayne's got an unlimited budget and can make this all happen just by a couple of signatures on the line that's dotted. Oh, that's sorry, I didn't mean to scare you away, but you know, I think that's really important that you bring up is that, you know, we have to all come together as you know, manned flight and as commercial space flight. As an industry, come together and work with our appropriators and legislators and say, you know, this is a priority because you know, we have to give our air traffic controllers the tools. We have to give the airspace system its best chance of success with all of these different vehicles in the airspace. And I think it's important and imperative for all of us to get together and join that push in towards the legislators and budgetary constraints, so we can give Wayne that full wallet of money that he's looking for. But all kidding aside, I think that's really important. You bring that up. There's a lot of things we need to do, and through the appropriations process, you know, it's not quick, and we have to recognize that. So rather than use Band-Aid approaches, it's better to start working together and get there to get in that direction. So definitely some good comments. So I'm just going to ask a quick speed round question. Can we continue on the same system, the way we've been doing business, based on the up tempo on the schedule for the next 5 to 10, 15 years? Audrey?
No. I think some of the points that Wayne made about the time that it takes to work through the current process, to actually get the information to the folks who need it. You know, some of this stuff is, you know, not very far off from hand calculations and picking up the telephone and calling someone, which seems a ridiculous result given the technology that we're trying to control. Right? We should have better technology available to manage these things. So I don't think so. I don't think we can continue to use the current system even for 5 years. 5 years is too long. I would suggest that half that is probably too long. So I really think that the longer we rely on the current tools, the current processes, the current you know, means of communication, the more you're going to see all of the users being disrupted in ways that are detrimental to you know, the constraints that they care about, whether it's the payloads that we're launching or the passengers and cargo that airlines are carrying. I think we're going to see more and more disruption to the operations that we're trying to achieve. And one thing that we haven't touched on exactly is, you know, as we move to a new and improved system for managing all of this, how do we put something in place that is a little more scalable than what we have today, right? So we're talking about not just flying humans to low Earth orbit and to the moon and other planets, but there are all kinds of different missions being contemplated, and not just by commercial space, but by other users that could appear that have needs in the airspace. So point-to-point missions, CONUS reentries. Right now we have you know, the majority of our reentries happening over the ocean, but operators are going to want to reenter capsules carrying all kinds of things. To CONUS, to land-based locations, and you know, interplanetary missions, and we have balloons launching through it, right? So how do we use a little bit of perspective to say the system that we put in place is going to have to accommodate new users, you know, real new users in the future?
Thank you.
Yeah.
You know, the spool up time that you know, we've seen. I mean, the entrepreneurial spirit of all the industry that's out there right now, just wanting to put payloads into space. But that's a great point you bring up, Audrey, is the fact that now we might be talking orbital travel, suborbital travel, where you're going to have vehicles that come back in with, like you say, mixed cargoes, passengers, et cetera. And I think that, you know, it's going to definitely put a strain on the system. we've just been talking about here in the United States, and you know, we're talking about, we're not the only country that's doing this discussion, although they're looking towards us in the United States as the leaders of the pack, if you will. Is there any interface going on right now with global partners and global governments? And I put this out to the whole panel. Anyone would like to take that? Are we reaching out to other entities that might be thinking about space operations that are out there? Anyone?
I can start.
Please,
We
Mike.
absolutely are.
Yeah.
We are in early consultation. Like I've already had initial discussions with maybe 9 different nations as we work to harmonize our regulatory construct. We don't want another outside agency determining what the regulation should look like, so we're trying to work with other space agencies to lay that foundation of commonality among spaceports, commonality among safety requirements, so that when we do get to the point, which I think we'll eventually get to, is point-to-point travel, suborbital, we've got a construct similar to the aviation industry where you know what to expect, so the U.S. flag carrier can go into another nation and they know what to expect. And so we absolutely are. As a matter of fact, we just signed a cooperative agreement, memorandum of cooperation with the German Space Agency, or Space and Research Agency, DLR, just last week, to start sharing data, but primarily sharing airspace access data and how they start preparing to be able to deconflict these operations.
That's great outreach. The fact and the detail and the level that you're getting into is really good, because obviously we're not the only country that's in this business right now. So I appreciate the push forward, like you say, by the administration and by the agency to be in front of it and dictate the rules rather than just receive the rules. So I think that it's good to be speaking with those other countries. That's great. We can open it up to questions. We see a question coming in from the text line, and then we'll open it up. If anyone has any questions and would like to approach the microphones now for our panelists here, feel free to approach a microphone, but I have a text message question that just came in, so if we could start with that.
Hi, Steve. This question is for the operators on the panel. Can you describe some of the specific pain points for each of your operations in the current process and where things could be done much better?
Paying points or pain points? We can get paid, but the pain points, I think, is what we're looking for.
So I'm happy to kick
ahead.
it off. So I would say probably one of the specific pain points that I would say we, as all operators, share is the large swaths of airspace that end up being segregated and for large chunks of time. And we spent a lot of time talking about that over the last 2 years, and the need, whether it's an algorithm enhancement or whatever it is. I think there are a number of things that are required to get that large chunk down to a smaller chunk and eventually, hopefully, eliminated. But that's a really key pain point for our community.
Right, yeah, I can jump in there. That's exactly right, Heidi. So think of the East Coast and a launch off the Cape. Generally, that will delay dozens of flights, perhaps more, into the hundreds to and from the East Coast, the New York airports, and Florida and the Caribbean and points south, waiting while that large piece of airspace is shut off. If the aircraft are able to get off the ground and are airborne, that looks like a fairly large reroute, a non-optimized route. Instead of flying down the East Coast over the water, typically the flight will be routed over land, which is a longer route and far less efficient time-wise, which is a delay again on the arrival side, and turns back to a delay on the departure for wherever the aircraft lands and departs from again. So those are big pain points, and those hurt reliability for the operation and for our customers, and ripple out into the rest of the system as those aircraft get to other places and connect to the next flight. So it's not just an aircraft piece, it's a crew piece as well, because those crews are burning time that wasn't scheduled into the operation. So those are the major pain points for us and our customers.
From a crew standpoint, you may have a diversion, you may have added stress dealing with fuel burn, calculating fuel burn, your rest requirements under the new regulations that we have. Those are issues that would be unanticipated as you took off, and if you're airborne, then you'd have to deal with those. Not an operator, but from pilot standpoint.
So maybe while we're waiting for another question, if I can throw something out, back to our speed dating round, I guess. Sure. So one of the things, I think the question was, can we move forward at the forecasted rate or projected rate of increased ops over the next 5 years, okay? I would say there's absolutely no way that we can. And I would kind of throw out the, something for folks to think about beyond commercial space ops. I mean, looking at the other new entrants that are, again, entrepreneurial and have some amazing business plans and opportunities that exist for urban air mobility, UAS, and all of the other great things that are on the horizon. There is absolutely no way that we can see a quadrupling of operations under the current airspace kind of process management that we have today. So I think we're going to need to see some pretty quick enhancements or modifications if we're going to see the expansion in ops.
It seems to me, Steve, that Heidi's absolutely right. Certainly the system can't absorb that many more operations. We don't have a lot of time to get to the beginning steps of figuring this out. So it seems like in Silicon Valley jargon, a lot of the companies that are coming in are disruptors, and I mean that in a good way. They move fast, they have tons of data, they're very agile, and they develop solutions. So working together collectively, we should be able to start taking the first steps on what those solutions look like, I think.
Understanding all the stakeholders, understanding all the stakeholders' needs, wants, desires for the future, having more communication like this, having everyone at the table saying, I need this for my operation, I need that, well, I need this, and I can adjust here and adjust there. That'll help design where we go. I agree, 5 years, I don't know that we know what it's going to look like in 5 years. It's going to be very, very different, the operations, the tempo.
I'd like to kind of circle back on that and take a different tack. We can absolutely do what we're doing for the next 5 years. Okay? Nobody's going to be happy, but we can do it. And I think where part of the narrative gets lost and slows down our forward progress is we talk about disruption as opposed to safety. When I look at this, and I've been doing this a long time, and I ran the Eastern Range, so I had to deconflict. Both sides disrupt each other to some level. A reroute costs money, costs time, there's other impacts. A single GA can stop a launch, and we've had that happen with Virgin Galactic operations, a single GA. On the Eastern Range, we had it with a single another government agency aircraft that was flying dark, chasing a drug boat, 3 souls on board. Stopped a big military launch, and we recycled. Unfortunately, we had 30 minutes, and in 27 minutes we launched. But a single aircraft can do that. So there are disruptions, and the last time we looked at it as an FAA on disruptions from space to the aviation community, we did the first 9 months of 2018. And we looked at all, through the Operations Center, all of the flights that were disrupted. And then we pulled out the ones that were caused by a space activity. It came out to 0.05%. So I know 0.05% is bad, particularly if you're on that aircraft, but I'm not sure that's the way to articulate to Congress and other places to fix this problem. It's a safety problem. We can't have a breakup that causes a catastrophic failure to an aircraft as well. And so from a disruption perspective, even if we double our load and it's linear, so now we're up to 0.1% of the disruptions in the NAS. Is that enough to cause us to really get energized about this? Remember I mentioned up front, we've been talking about this for over 20 years. So what's the trigger point? Is it 50 space launches a year, of which only about 20 will actually interrupt the NAS? Is it 100? I'm not sure what that trigger point is, but I think if we don't change the narrative to a safety perspective, because everybody understands safety, and we talked about risk at the beginning of this too, the American people understand safety and how safe our NAS is. I think that's where we really need to move this narrative if we're going to make progress in a timely fashion and really get ahead of this.
Well said, and that's exactly where we all need to be focused on is safety, which there's no doubts in my mind that the industry that's here and the folks that are on this panel all agree that safety is where we need to be, and I'm happy to hear you say that, Wayne. Thank you for reinforcing that. That needs to be where the discussion has to be is safely operating these aircraft. Inconvenience is inconvenience. That's the way it goes. But from an optimal standpoint for our profitability of our corporations, it's definitely a consideration, but safety first at all.
And I think if we can get folks around the safety mantra, we can solve these other problems even quicker, because they are problems and they're going to continue. The disruption, like I stated up front, both of these industries have to thrive for national economy, national security. I just think if we just turn even slightly towards, let's fix this from a safety perspective, I think we can get there quicker.
And it's going to be a tall task to do all this and do it effectively, safely. It's kind of like doing open heart surgery on a marathon runner in the middle of the race as you're trying to change things around and get up to that up tempo. It's definitely a tall task, but like we've said at the beginning, it's all about getting together and talking this out. So encouraging words. We've got a text message question that came in, if we could go ahead with that.
Yeah, we actually received a couple of questions about SMS and future operations. Those are good questions, but they might be better for a future panel. But there was a follow-up to the original question about pain points. Could Audrey from Blue Origin speak about what their pain points are in launching?
Sure. So even when you look at something like suborbital operations that we run out of Texas, we've been doing this long enough now that we know we're more familiar with the traffic patterns going into LAX, for example, that go right over our launch site from a number of East Coast and South locations. So we know that if we go request on this specific day at this specific time, that's not optimal for the air traffic system. So it might be optimal for the particular operation that we're trying to run for whatever reason it might be, whether it's a payload on board or our operations cadence. And so we understand, given the current system, the impact that we're going to have on that. When you look at things like whether it's launching any normal day of the year or looking at a HARP period. So as the cadence of these operations start to increase, there are companies with goals of launching every week, right? And some of the numbers that Wayne quoted earlier, that's what you're going to be looking at, people launching multiple times a month. And when you look at the HARP system that exists right now, and you have a week blocked out over Thanksgiving, or a week and a half blocked out over Christmas and the New Year. That's not necessarily something that's going to bode well for commercial space operators that are trying to fly every week. And so how do we, and the situations that Blue Origin has specifically had in the past where we've called up Dwayne or his team and said, hey, we think we might be aiming to launch on the first day of this HARP. What does that look like? And they have been very gracious with, okay, let us go off and see if we can figure out how to make this work. They're already getting into the mindset that we've got to figure out a path to those kinds of things in the future. So there are those pieces ingrained already in the system that we bump up against, even with a suborbital operation in Texas, let alone the eastern range where you have much more activity going on and the busiest flight corridor in the nation.
Great point, and definitely a great shout out to Dwayne and his folks at the command center, and also to our line air traffic controllers that are working this traffic. And while we're doing these launches, I think it takes a lot of work to get it done the way we're doing it now, and we'll increase the tempo as we go forward. So with that, I'd like to close out our panel. I'd like to thank our panelists for joining us today. If you would join me in giving them a round of applause. Thank you all.